Hi guys, Dan here. Today we have an 8.5 horse Craftsman snowblower that's in for a tune-up. Customer said it doesn't run well, the wheels are not working on it, and it needs a general tune-up. He's not too familiar with everything that's wrong with it, but he knows it needs some work. So I took it in, taking a quick look at it. It's a 15 cubic inch 15A 114-0342-E1, made in 2005. It's a pretty standard engine for Briggs, and pretty common snowblower that they made. This one's made 2005. See a lot of these out there, very similar models. And this engine is pretty common. You notice it doesn't have a throttle control, it just has an on-off switch. And the reason they do that is to cut down on price. Now, see if you can spot the problem here. So through all that noise, you might be able to hear a sound, and that's the cylinder head leaking. Another issue on these Briggs engines I see is the pull cords always get frayed pretty quickly. I don't think this machine's been used much, even though it's 10 years old, but the cord is definitely in need of replacement, so we'll swap that out as well. Let's take it apart and see what it looks like. So we need to strip back the engine and get to the cylinder head gasket. So first thing we do is take off the carb cover. You can see the two wires in the back attached to the safety shutoff switch, the key switch. One of those wires is grounded and one of those wires goes back to the coil. And then pull the primer line off, get rid of that cover. The cover on the fuel tank bezel around the bottom of the tank needs to come off. There are two screws in the front, one screw on the side. Keep track of those screws because they're dark screw, they're a black screw, and they only fit that cover area. Same for the screws that are on the lower carburetor cover, as you see here. Hang on to those screws so you put it back together and it looks correct when it's done. So we'll continue taking it apart. Take the control rod out for the chute. Hang on to the cotter pin, stick it through there so you don't lose it. And we're going to strip back the rest of the motor. These engines have a real common issue with the head gasket. I've replaced 3 of these this week, and most of the time it happens between 5 and 10 years old on the engine. It's a good running engine. It's got a nice tight governor system on it. They run really well, but as soon as you get a compression leak like that, you're going to have fuel mixture problems and hunting problems, and if you let it run too long, you'll start to degrade the aluminum where the leak is. You could burn it. So it's a pretty common issue. So whenever I pick one of these machines up, I always give that handle a pull, slow pull, to see if there's solid compression. And if it just falls through on the compression stroke, I listen to see if there's a leak. And most of the time there is a leak. So I usually know what I'm in for when I pick up one of these machines and go through it. So pretty common issue. Here the fuel tank has just a line out of the tank right over to the carburetor. I'm going to add a shutoff valve on that just for safety, and I'll show you that later in the video. So now we'll take off the cover on the muffler. This is just a plastic cover that blows air past the muffler to keep it cool. Take off the governor cover here. This just covers the governor mechanism. Make sure you put that back on before you put the tank on. Now we'll continue taking off the carburetor filter bracket here. These carburetors are used with no filter, and the reason for that is there's no dust in the snow, so they don't have a filter on it. All they have is a flame arrestor. It's like looks like a screen door on them with a couple of layers. So if you get a backfire, that arrestor will just stop that flame from happening. So use a little WD on these. I back them in and out a few times because they use a locking glue on the threads. And if you just get a little WD in there and you move them back and forth, tighten them and loosen them a few times, they loosen right up. And the last thing you want to have is one of those things snapping off in the cylinder head, then you have to drill it out or just replace the head. So they do come out pretty easily once they're done. So we'll take the carburetor off. There's a little spring on the rod to keep the tension on the governor system, and just leave that on there and take the carb off. This carburetor is pretty gooky looking, and I think it's been sitting around for quite a while. I'll take it apart, put a new needle and seat in it, and clean the carburetor out. Because this engine is a single speed engine, you don't have to worry so much about that carburetor mixing well at idle speeds. It's more of like that carburetor runs at a mid-range speed all the time. So if you got a good mix at that speed, you don't have to worry so much about having an idle circuit, a transition circuit, a high-speed circuit. So that's another thing about these single-speed engines that's forgiving. You just turn it on and run it. If it runs great at full throttle and it's clear and clean, it'll work fine for you. So they're a little bit on the forgiving side. You don't have to finesse the carburetor so much. So here we'll take off the muffler, and there's a Torx head in that bolt, and I think is also a 10mm hex on the outside of that bolt, something like 10. Usually you can get away with reusing that carb gasket over. They're just like a soft material, almost like the head gasket. They usually come apart from the engine on one side in a whole piece, so you can usually get away with using them. They're like $4. So if you have to replace them, you have to replace them, but you can usually get away with it. So here I'm taking the plate off the governor. There's a governor arm that sticks through this plate. This is the mounting plate for the gas tank. You can see there's a wire on there. That's the wire that's used to short the coil to ground, so make sure you put that back on. That wire goes on the bolt with the big post on it. You can see the post, the long one there. Make sure that goes back in the same spot when you reassemble it. This is a shield that's used to blow air past the cylinder head to cool it. It's a pain in the neck to get at that back bolt, but you do have to take it off, and you do have to put it back on when you're done. That shield basically covers all the fins and makes the air blow through it the right way. You can see on the inside of the shield all that black, and you see the white spot in it. That's the cylinder head where it blew through and was blowing out onto that shield. So just showing that bolt and a little 7mm wrench. So now we're going to take off the valve cover. The valve cover has 4 bolts on it. 2 are the same, and the other 2 are both different. So the top one's very short, the 2 side ones are the same length, and the bottom one is a fine thread bolt. So keep those bolts with the cover because they're all unique, and you need to use the exact same ones in there. Don't make the mistake of threading those in and then stripping them because you got a coarse thread bolt in a fine thread hole. Put them in by hand at first, and then snug them up. They just need to be snug. You can actually reuse that valve cover gasket most of the time as well. The shortest bolt goes toward the top. So here I'm speeding up the video. I'm just cracking loose the 4 head bolts to hold on the cylinder head, and then I'm going to back them out really quickly and show you the cylinder head. You see I've got the rockers and push rods still in there. The push rods and rockers can stay in there. You can pull the head right off. Don't bother taking all that stuff apart. It's more work you don't need to do. I'll show you how to put that together later. So here we go, backed out the cylinder head, and you can see right at the top of that cylinder head the mark that all the escaping gases have made. It's burned right through the gasket, and you can see there's clearly been a leak there. So the rest of the head looks like it's in pretty good shape. I pushed the valves down, and they're nice and smooth. It looks like it got plenty of lubrication. Here's the block itself where that leak went through. It looks like it actually burned into the block, but it really didn't do any damage. I put a straight edge on there, and I couldn't see really any noticeable change in that area. So we'll clean that face up, maybe hit it with a file here and there, take everything off and make sure it's flat, and put it back together. The push rods are the same. They're both made of the same material. They're not different like on some of the other engines. I roll them together here and just take a quick pass over them and make sure that they're straight, and they both look straight. So I'll reuse those. You don't have to replace those. Now I'm going to clean up the piston and gasket area a little bit. This engine doesn't look like it's been run, maybe 10 or 12 hours. It really doesn't look like it's run much. I hit some carburetor cleaner on that piston and wiped it with a rag, and everything came off. There's really no carbon on it at all. So I'm not sure what the story is behind this machine. It seems like it was used a little bit and developed a leak because of a assembly error, or was maybe sat around for a while and then was used. But it doesn't have a ton of time on it because there's no carbon really in it at all. And same for the for the head. I sprayed some stuff on the cylinder head, cleaned the faces of the valves, checked the seats and everything. Everything looks fine. The valves are sealing, and you can push those valves open with your fingers. The springs are pretty forgiving. They're not very hard to push, and the valves slide fine. So here's the head before cleaning. Again, you can see where the leak was. And what I'll do on this head is clean up the carbon and clean up the corners of the head where the bolts go through, and make sure that those corners are fine and there's nothing sticking out where it would reduce the pressure that is put on the gasket when you torque it down. I try to actually whittle those corners back a little bit, take that half a thousandths off them, so when you squeeze the head down, the round area around the combustion chamber pushes harder on the gasket. So head's all cleaned up. I'm just showing you the old gasket here and where it was on the cylinder head. You can see the old gasket's got a hole right through it. That should be solid material around there. Now here we're looking at the new gasket. I put the gasket on. You can see the gasket doesn't line up, and that's because the gasket's on the wrong side. So it only goes on one way, and you'll know you have it on the right way when the index pins are through and all the holes line up. Pretty simple gasket to put on. So both faces are clean, and I'm going to put the head back on the engine with the new gasket. You notice I don't have the push rods in there, and I'll show you how to slide those babies in just a second. We're going to torque down the head to 225 inch-pounds. If you look in the Briggs Stratton book, it'll show you that it's 225 inch-pounds or 25 Newton meters, and that's about 18 foot-pounds. So I torqued the head up. I didn't show it here, but I did torque it up to 18 or 19 foot-pounds. So I've got the push rods. I'm going to clean them up here, and then I'm going to slide them into the cylinder head, and slide them all the way in. There's a little tappet on the inside that you have to feel around for and make sure it lines up, but I've got it in the tappet, and what I'm going to do is just push that valve in and slide the push rod rocker arm over. So here I'm just lining that up, and you can see the intake is opening and the exhaust is closed. So I'm just going to push down on that valve and slide those arms over, and so I got it at least in the ballpark, and we'll set the clearances next, but I just want to check to make sure that I've got the push rod onto the tappet and both valves are working. So this is the book that gives you the torque specs for the cylinder head and the valve clearance. So the valve clearance is 4 to 6 and 9 to 11 on the exhaust, and then the cylinder head you can see is 220 inch-pounds. As for a 15 cubic inch overhead valve engine, horizontal shaft. So here I'm setting the clearance. I'm going to set the intake to 5 and the exhaust to like 9, 8 or 9. I think the exhaust is 6 to 11 or something like that. So I like to set them a little bbit tight, because these engines, once they warm up, those rockers start to chatter a little bit, and I just hate that noise. It sounds like the tappets are loose. So I set them a little bit tight. So I think I set this to 4 or 5, and I set the exhaust to 9 or 10. So there's a center stopper and then outside bolt. You don't need a ton of pressure on these things. You just need to set the clearance, and then use the outer wrench to torque them down. Hold the inside in and turn the outside to snug them up, or you can do the opposite. It doesn't need a ton of pressure to hold it, but be careful. If you use too much pressure, you can snap those studs off. They're not super strong, and again, you don't need a lot of pressure. It's only a 6-horse engine, or 8-horse engine. So I set them both and get the clearances right, and go from there. So we made some adjustments to these. Keep fumbling around with them a little bit and get the clearance right at 10 on the exhaust and 5 on the intake. So I probably could have cut some of this out, but I just wanted to show me fumbling around with getting them set. They can be a pain in the neck. In all honesty, most of the time I just check them for a little bit of clearance, and if they're close, I call it good. So one thing I do want to show you here is the compression release. So if you look here, I'm spinning through the cycle on the engine. That's the exhaust valve. I have my hand on there, so I'm going to go intake, compression. Now I'm on compression here, and you notice that the exhaust valve pops in a little bit. It pushes in a little bit, and then all of a sudden it snaps back. Well, that's the compression release. So if you have excessive clearance in your valve there, you won't get your compression release, and your engine will be hard to pull, and sometimes it'll pull back on you because you get so much compression. Once in a while, the compression release on the camshaft will break. It's a little pin that sticks out on the cam inside the engine, and it'll break, and you have to split the engine to get the compression release, put a new camshaft in with the new compression release. There, a couple of years there, they were kind of delicate, and a lot of them broke. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that it's a real common issue on some of the like 20-horse single-cylinder lawn tractors, where the guys can't get the engines to start. They keep putting batteries in them. The starter can't turn it, and the reason is because there's no compression release. So they have excessive valve clearance on the exhaust side, and that's what causes that problem. So anyway, put a new plug, thread a new plug in here to keep things from falling in there, and then just install the valve cover on there. Again, using the right bolts. The short one goes on top. The two coarse thread ones go on the side, and there's a fine thread on the bottom. So we're going to slide this shield back into place. This thing's a pain in the ass. You can see I'm fishing the wire up through there. That's the wire that goes to the low side of the coil, and that's used to shut it off. So that wire and the high tension wire need to come through that little split, and then you can just get yourself set up there and get the screw in the back tightened up, and thread your plug back in here. You'll take that plug out to get the shield in. So anyway, so it's in, and I'll just snug it up, and then we'll put the wire on it, ready to go, and we'll move on. Make sure that those wires are not going by the flywheel underneath there, underneath that shield. Sometimes those wires can be a little long, and they come close to the flywheel, and then all of a sudden the flywheel pick them up and short them out. So here I'm reusing the exhaust gasket. It's fine, and I'm going to just screw the muffler back down on it. Make sure that muffler is straight, parallel, like those two mounting holes for the muffler, or for the carburetor cover. Make sure those are parallel with the front of the engine, and that way that cover will go on and look nice. Here I'm putting back the 4 bolts that hold the gas tank mounting bracket in place. On that long one with the stud on it, make sure you put that wire underneath it. That's the wire that's used to ground out the ignition when you shut it off. And then just snug those up. I also put the bolt back in for the oil fill tube in the back there near the yellow fill tube. So this is the carburetor. It's pretty grungy looking. I'm going to clean it up, and I've magically cleaned it up here, It doesn't look much different on the outside. Actually, it wasn't too bad on the inside. So this spacer bracket is like a phenolic or plastic bracket. Sometimes they have a taper on one side on the inlet tube, but that needs to go back in place, and I'm putting it back in place here, just hooking on the governor or the throttle control wire and the little spring that keeps it taut before you put the carburetor on. You can't get it on after, so put that on first, and then get your carburetor mounting bolts. And they still have a lot of glue on them from the factory, so I didn't put any blue Loctite on them, but you can. They tend to corrode a little bit, and they always seem to be kind of tough to get out, so I don't never really worry about them loosening up. So just snug these up. You don't have to go crazy. And then I'm going to put the carburetor bracket back on here. This carburetor actually didn't have the arresting screen in front of it. That's something they came out with probably 5 or 8 years ago. This machine's a little older than that. So if this one backfires flame, I guess they just assume it's going to put itself out. So on the newer ones, they do have that screen. So here I'm just putting on the recoil assembly cover, and you see how, I just wanted you to see how that recoil cover goes on. It slides onto that shield, and then the tab shows toward the top, and then there are 3 bolts that hold that cover on. This is an older style cover, so to put a new pull cord on it, you have to take this whole cover off, which is kind of a pain in the neck. I put a new pull cord on this while I had it apart. I just didn't show it. So thread in the 3 bolts, make sure everything is nice and flat where the cover goes on flat. You don't have a wire pinched under it or anything like that. Get it kind of centered up, and then I'm just gonna torque it up quick with the wrench. So here's the governor arm. I just wanted to show you this. This is a Briggs governor, so the shaft comes out of the engine, goes to this arm, and then the arm goes right over to the carburetor, and then you can see there's a spring, and then the spring goes to a solid tab, and then there's a tab on the arm with a bunch of holes in it. All those holes are in a chart in the Briggs carburetor book, and it tells you what hole to put it in for what style engine, and if it's a single speed or multi-speed, it tells you where to put it. So you bend that tab to actually set the top no load speed. So here I'm just going to add that shutoff valve like I told you before. What I'm going to do is use that old hose and cut that old hose. It's a little bit short, but it goes over, it'll bend over the carburetor okay. Instead of putting a new hose on, that hose is in real good shape, so I'll just use that hose. So I put a little stub on here with some new clamps, put the fuel valve on there, and that's the on position, the horizontal position, and that's the off position. And you can see above it that little round black sticker on the tank is the original cover over the hole, that because there was no fuel valve there, they just put a cover over it. They put a sticky cover. So here's the tank, how it should look on the machine with that's the original hose. I cut it, put some clamps on it, and it's like an 1/8 or 1/4 inch short, and I just stretch it over, but it's got plenty of room. It's not going to hit anything. You can see it actually looks pretty good. So I just wanted to show you what that looks like. So that's in the off position there, and then I'm going to just show you, but after you have the tank mounting plate back on the machine, make sure you put the governor cover in place, and then your tank drops on there. So the tank drops on, and then there are 4 bolts, 2 in the front, 2 in the back, and they're like a standoff bolt. I think they're 10 millimeter or 3/8, one or the other, but they're very unique. There's 4 of them, and they have a big standoff on them, so you know they're tank mounting bolts. So tank's mounted on, and I'm just going to put this is just another one of these air shields or some kind of bracket shield airflow thing that fits the machine, and I'm just going to put this on quickly. These are 2 black fine thread screws. I believe they're 6mm, like a fine thread screw. And they just snug up to the cylinder head. Make sure you use the right ones because you'll strip the head if they're coarse thread. So there's also one small pan head screw in the back that screws to that plastic bracket. So we're pretty close. So let's put some gas in it and fire it off. Okay, give it a little choke here and fire it off. Excellent. Okay, it's running fine. So let's finish it up and get it back to the customer. So now we'll put all the jelly bean stuff back on. This is the cover for the fuel tank. You have to turn the gas valve to the off position in order to slide this on. Make sure you run your wires for your shut-off switch back around the bracket that holds the tank on. It's a little bit confusing there. You just don't want to get anything pinched in there. And then once you have those in place, put the cover bolts back on. Again, those are like a hex head, and they also have a 5/16 head on them. Just get your cover on. There are two on the front and one on the back. Just make sure your gas valve is sticking out far enough so it works. So we'll put the bottom cover on for the carburetor. That's the same style bolts that hold the ignition switch cover on under the tank. Here I hit it with a little WD to keep the moisture from bothering things. Keep a little bit of moisture on the, or a little bit of oil on the governor mechanism, and just to keep the general condensation off the machine. So put the cover on for the muffler assembly. This keeps the air blowing past the muffler. It's a plastic cover. It lives right next to the muffler, and as long as the air is blowing by, it doesn't melt. So here I'm going to put a new primer line on. This is the cover for the carburetor. Got the primer line on, and then I've got the two wires that come up to the key switch. One is just a ground wire, and one is the wire that goes back to the coil and the switch, the on-off switch. So both of those things, all those wires do is ground the coil wire, the on-off switch, and the key switch. They both do the same thing. So now we'll put the cover back on, and I've got a couple of stainless steel number 10 24 screws here, nice screws to put back on that we're missing. Check the choke, that works fine. So let's fire it off. Test the key, make sure that works. Great. We'll test the ignition switch. Excellent, all works great. Thanks for watching.